Thank you very much, Caroline, and to Donal, and to you all for offering me this opportunity to share a few thoughts on the historic context of cherishing all the children of the nation. I'm very grateful for that. I'm very privileged and honoured. I'm very conscious of the sterling work that you all do in relation to welfare, in relation to cherishing. And I particularly want to thank Kenneth Burns and the committee for their invitation to come here today and for their hospitality and their impressive organisation. Though you do have to question the competence of a committee in Cork that would ensure that the first two speakers up to the microphone are actually dubs. But I'm sure that will be rectified in the coming hours. The phrase, cherishing all the children of the nation equally, is obviously one that we will hear repeatedly over the course of the next few months in the run-up to the centenary of the 1916 Rising, the birth of the modern Irish Republic, the foundational act, that rising of what became the Irish Republic. It's an iconic moment in modern Irish history, and it does prompt all sorts of reflections, opportunities, but perhaps also distortions that we need to be conscious of. Cherishing all the children of the nation equally has been repeatedly used in the past also. It's been latched on to a variety of different causes and battles and campaigns. It has often been wrenched from its historic context, as was alluded to by Caroline in the opening. And there have been various assertions made about it. Most recently, the historian Charles Townsend suggested that it was a kind of a distillation of national doctrine, or a kind of a national poem. And I think that's true in the sense that we can all recite it from memory. It rolls off the tongue, but perhaps we don't interrogate it always to the extent that we should. I'm very conscious, being here in Cork, that one of the redoubtable historians to come out of this institution, Professor John A. Murphy, has been very critical of what he sees as the unthinking use of the phrase cherishing all the children of the nation equally. The idea that it is divorced from its historic context. The idea that what it meant at the time in 1916 was the idea of bringing nationalists and unionists together, though very few involved in the 1916 enterprise had given enough thought as to how you might actually do that, or what it might mean in practice. It didn't mean children, as we understand the word today. And yet, John A. Murphy's comments have also been challenged. The idea that it no longer belongs to the authors, cherishing all the children of the nation equally. That phrase doesn't belong to the authors of the 1916 proclamation. The idea that they bequeathed it to us, to the generations that were coming afterwards. The idea that it was for living generations to make of it what they wanted, according to the lights of their time. And I'm certainly with John A. Murphy in relation to the importance of historical context and the need to try and see the Ireland of 1916 through the lens of the people of 1916. But if this focus on the idea of cherishing the children of the nation equally does prompt a historical assessment of how children have been treated since 1916, if it does cause us time to reflect on the status of children over that 100 years, well then it can be a very good thing and a very fruitful focus. Alongside the proclamation of 1916, there are many other things that awakened an interest in me about the status of children over the course of modern Irish history. For anyone who is preoccupied with social history, it's an absolutely essential theme to try and grasp, to try and understand, to try and contextualize, to try and find documented. But there are other things that were relevant to me in particular as a historian when I was making my way through various stages of my early career in history. One of the things that struck me particularly in the 1980s and 1990s was a new attention on memoirs of Irish childhood, the personal testimony, the idea that there was a very large audience, it appeared, for accounts of Irish childhood. The idea that there was a new focus on the personal testimony, the idea that it also almost provided a parallel stream of information that could go alongside the documented record, and in many respects gave a vibrancy and personal immediacy that could fill in a lot of the gaps, because the documented record might tell you what happened, but it rarely tells you what it felt like and what it felt like to be a child during those times. So that was certainly something that got me thinking. And another thing that was very relevant was the decade of revelations, as I call it, the 1990s. the extent of the information that came into the public domain about the historic treatment of children and in institutionalization in particular. A whole plethora of reports, of inquiries, of committees that were looking into what were very, very difficult historic subjects, though they weren't always historic as we were to discover to our concern. This idea that there were a whole host of hidden histories that needed to be uncovered. That certainly was another thing that prompted a great interest in the history of childhood. Great opportunities there, again, to look back and also to try and contextualize, to try and understand why there was this reliance on institutions, why there was this particular treatment of children at various stages. And how did that work at various stages? How did the landscape of childhood change over the course of the 20th century? And what were the continuities that were relevant to the experiences of childhood as well as the changes that were apparent? How did society come to see children differently at different stages? What were the causes? What are the milestones that the historian might identify in relation to the changing landscape of childhood or the changing understandings of childhood, as well as the obvious continuities? Certainly when I talk about what caused society to see children differently, you also have to talk about what caused society to hide children, to ensure that they weren't seen, to ensure that they weren't visible. This is where the whole notion of the architecture of containment becomes such a dominant theme of late 19th and early 20th century history. If you have a look at the introduction of the industrial school system into Ireland, for example, in 1868, what you're dealing with there over the course of the next 100 years up to the 1960s are 105,000 children who found themselves in those industrial schools. And they're only one form of institution that was relevant to the welfare of children during that period. Officially, of course, they were residents of those institutions. In practice, they were often inmates. In practice, they were often subjected to horrendous treatment. And even as early as 1900, there is a report on the industrial schools that suggests the conditions within those schools are better imagined than described. And that was a report on the industrial school system from 1900. We also had, before that, in the late 19th century, the emergence of societies specifically devoted to the welfare of children. The emergence in 1889, for example, of the Dublin Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Children. And this did result in opposition. The idea that this was contesting the image of Ireland as the maternal isle that did indeed cherish its children. There were those who were opposed to the emergence of this society in 1889 on the grounds that there was no cruelty to Dublin children in the late 19th century. So you always had that kind of opposition. You also then, of course, had the landmark that's been referred to already by Donald, the 1908 Children's Act. And again, we shouldn't forget the extent to which this was heralded as a revolutionary piece of legislation in 1908. The idea that parents could be called to account for neglect. The idea that courts could be an agency for the rescue of children. But we also know that it meant in practice that courts could also be an agency for the punishment of children. We can talk about a Charter of Children's Rights, and that's how it was often presented in 1908. But that did not mean that it was a charter for children's liberties. And we have to distinguish between rights and liberties in relation to the emergence of the 1908 Children's Act. Health was also very relevant, obviously, to the welfare of children. Mention was made there earlier on of the slums that were so characteristic of the landscape, the urban landscape in particular, in the early 20th century. But well beyond that, what we have in 1911, for example, are 72,000 deaths being recorded in Ireland. And of that 72,000, 1/5, 20%, were children under the age of 5. They were the stark statistics in Ireland in 1911. Another relevant theme, of course, was education. And again, we have to acknowledge those who were challenging the prevailing system, the ethos that was apparent in Ireland 100 years ago. Patrick Pearse will be frequently invoked in the coming months as a result of the key role he played in the organisation of the 1916 Rising, the first president of the Republic. But he was also, of course, a very significant educationalist. The publication of The Murder Machine, for example, in 1913, gave him an opportunity, gave him a platform to articulate the belief that the approach to education had to change fundamentally. The idea of a focus on new education, the idea of trying to absorb best practice internationally and apply it to the system in Ireland at that time, which of course was the British system in Ireland at that time. The idea that the individual child was to be valued, that their freedom of choice was to be cherished, the idea that they were capable and should be facilitated in exercising free choice. Again, a very progressive attitude or idea in the Ireland of 1913 and 1914. But there was much, of course, that was far removed from the kind of idealised childhood that Patrick Pearse wanted to see, or the kind of cherishing that he wanted to see. And we can see that in fact, and we can see it in fiction. We can see it in another landmark publication the following year. James Joyce's Dubliners, published in 1914, contains a number of stories that make it clear that Joyce was very conscious of the extent of physical violence against children in the Ireland of 100 years ago. Have a look at the short story Counterparts, for example, that forms part of the Dubliners' collection. The terrified child, subjected to horrific abuse by the violent alcoholic father. "Don't beat me, Pa," he pleads, "and I will say a Hail Mary for you." Joyce must have been absorbing the reality of what it was like for children in the Dublin of the early 20th century. And it's only 2 years later, of course, that we have this landmark proclamation of 1916. Children are mentioned 4 times in the 1916 proclamation. It's not just about cherishing all the children of the nation equally. It's also about Irish children being summoned to the flag. There's also a reference to the exiled children in America. And there's also a reference to the readiness of children to sacrifice themselves for the common good. So 4 references to children, specifically to children. And what we see here in the 1916 proclamation, I think, is the extent to which incipient citizenship is being referred to in the context of children. The idea that there's a conflation between childhood and citizenship and citizenry. And that's a very dominant theme, I think, of that revolutionary era. If you have a look at the democratic programme, for example, of 1919, that was enunciated at the time the first Dáil met in 1919, you can see very specific references to children, and this time they refer to children. The idea that there's much more concrete commitments being made. The idea that it is the first duty of the government of the Republic to make provision for the spiritual and mental well-being of its children, to ensure that none of those children will go cold, will go hungry, to ensure that they have shelter. Very specific commitments. But there were those who were prepared to admit in private in the 1920s in politics that they saw the democratic programme as largely poetry. And I think what we're dealing with here is a great gulf between the rhetoric on the one hand and the reality. In the midst of the War of Independence, for example, we find a letter written by William T. Cosgrave, who went on to become the first president of the Executive Council, in effect the first leader of the Free State in the early 1920s. At that time, he was Minister for Local Government. He wrote a letter to his colleague Austin Stack, the Minister for Home Affairs, in relation to children who were reared in workhouses. Children who are reared in workhouses, he said, as you know, are no great acquisition to the community. As a rule, their highest aim is to live at the expense of the ratepayer. It will be a decided gain, he said, if they all took it into their head to emigrate. Now, it would be invidious to single out William T. Cosgrave as having been particularly harsh or judgmental. He was a product of that climate. He grew up in Victorian Ireland like so many of his colleagues. And what they were doing in private, of course, was expressing these views, which stood in stark contrast to some of the commitments that were made about the Republic and about citizenry. And this is where we have to be aware of the Republic as a political as opposed to a social project. In Seamus Dean's words, what this quest for a republic was about was a desperate search for purity, but it's a purity in the political sense. Childhood, in a sense, becomes, in the words of Declan Kuyber, a kind of an expendable cultural object. The idea that it's a part of the revolutionary sentiment, the idea that it's a part of the Celtic revival of the late 19th and the early 20th century. That it is about Ireland's status as a colony, that Ireland needs to be reimagined as a child, unsullied, uncontaminated. The idea that childhood exists outside almost of the culture that is producing it in the late 19th and the early 20th century. So we do need to be aware of how that was operating during that formative revolutionary period. But then we have the switch to nation building very soon afterwards in the early 1920s. And again, education is to the forefront in relation to the task of children and the status of children. The first National Programme Conference, for example, in the early 1920s, to decide on a curriculum for the new state, for the primary schools of the new state. And what that really amounted to, of course, was a new focus. The idea of the children as the foot soldiers, the mini foot soldiers in the vanguard, to preserve Gaelic purity, to preserve the Irish language, to ensure that the Irish language became the spoken language of the people. It was a much narrower curriculum than had existed in 1900, the previous time the curriculum had been devised. There was a focus in 1900 on the idea of developing the child from within as opposed to moulding the child from without. But what we got with this new programme conference at that stage, the beginning, or just before the creation of the new state, was this relentless focus on the need to use children and to use the classroom in order to promote the Irish language. And the way that Timothy Corcoran, the Jesuit professor of education in UCD at the time, put it, was that the vital years for vernacular usage in relation to the Irish language were from the ages of 3 onwards. So children were being charged with that particular task from that very early stage. And Corcoran was very adamant that there needed to be a very strict and authoritarian approach to educating these children because of this belief that emanated from the doctrine of original sin. That children were, of course, born in a state of sin and needed strong, strict authoritarian rule and teaching in order to become model citizens and champions of a Gaelic way of life. Now, there were other measures that were relevant in the 1920s in relation to education. The School Attendance Act of 1926, for example, which made it compulsory that children would stay in education from the ages of 6 to the ages of 14. But there was much political lobbying that went on behind the scenes. The idea that this would act to the detriment of rural Ireland, that children were needed as agricultural labourers, that they were needed at home, that they needed to be taken out of school well before the age of 14 in order to contribute to the task of rural Ireland. And attendance rates were still under 70% as you move on to 1930. And that's also the year that we get the Vocational Schools Act in 1930. And again, here you can see the extent to which class considerations are intersecting in relation to the framing of educational policy. Many an errant middle-class child was threatened with the idea of going to school in the tech after the creation of these schools in the early 1930s. The idea that those who were going to those schools, in the words of the historian Joe Lee, were regarded as second-class citizens, because there was a failure to prepare them for the Leaving Cert remaining, of course, to preserve of the better off. There was also, during that decade, the 1930s, a lot of focus on the illegitimate child. Now, the extent to which that word is loaded and the damage that that particular word does over the course of these decades is paramount. If you consider the years 1922 to 1987, you're dealing with 125,701 children who were born illegitimate, who were classed as illegitimate because they were born outside of marriage. Their mortality rates were frequently 5 times higher than those children who were considered legitimate. As late as 1952, 25% of illegitimate children in Ireland died as infants. You also, during that decade, had a focus, but behind the scenes, on the problem of the sexual abuse of children. The Carrigan Report of 1931, for example, which was convened to focus on the question of juvenile prostitution, the operation of the laws against sexual offences and how they were impacting on women and on children in particular. And what we got during the proceedings was evidence from the Garda Commissioner, Ono Duffy, that the extent of child abuse was alarming. That you had, during that period, an estimated incidence of sexual abuse, particularly in relation to children under the age of 10, that was alarming. And he also suggested that less than 15% of those cases of child abuse were being prosecuted. The important point about this is not just that it underlined the extent of the problem, but also that many didn't believe it, and that certainly the government was not going to publish the Carrigan Report. And there was no robust discussion of the Carrigan Report until the 1990s when it finally came in to the public domain. So you have those discussions, you have those findings behind the scenes. You do have Fianna Fáil in power in the 1930s committing itself to the idea of the welfare of the child, the idea of greater state support, the idea of trying to build some kind of an architecture of a welfare state, or at least begin it. You do have the introduction of widows' and orphans' pensions, for example, during this decade. But the focus very much remained on the perceived problem of sexual immorality, the idea that there needed to be a very firm response to those who were challenging the notion of Ireland as being particularly chaste, as being particularly pure, to go back to some of the rhetoric of the earlier period. That's why we get the Criminal Law Amendment Act in 1935, which results in the prohibition on the importation and sale of contraceptives. You might say, what has that got to do with children? It's got a hell of a lot to do with children. During the early 1970s, Jack Lynch was frequently receiving correspondence as Taoiseach from individuals who had been profoundly affected by that legislation, the children who had been affected by that legislation. In 1972, for example, he received a letter from A.J. Wallace in London, a 24-year-old who had spent all of his life in institutions before he escaped to London, born in an orphanage, ended up in Artane Industrial School. And what he said to Lynch in 1972, "You have no idea how the lives of thousands of unwanted babies are a result of the Criminal Law Amendment Act of 1935, and how so many of those lives have been ruined." The 1930s is also crucial, of course, because it's the decade of the Irish Constitution, the Constitution that we still have today. What we see here is an articulation of, it seems, Republican civic ideals. But how relevant are they in the case of children? Why are they denied the status of differentiated citizenship under the Constitution of 1937? Is it fair to say that those framing the Constitution in 1937 ensured that children were primarily conduits for parental rights, the vindication of parental rights, the assertion of parental rights as opposed to children's rights? Children are deemed in the Constitution to have natural and imprescriptible rights, but what does that actually mean in practice? It remains very vague, it remains very undefined. Is there also contained within the provisions of the Constitution a license to curb the rights of children? The idea that the state might act in loco parentis, but what does that mean in practice, given that the Constitution idealises the family unit as the fundamental basis of Irish society? But when the state is acting in loco parentis, it can also decide on alternatives to the family environment. And as we are aware, many of those alternative environments certainly did not live up to the Republican ideals of that generation. We also have, during that period in the late 1930s, very startling information, again, about what those institutions might mean in practice. The mother and baby homes, for example, that were alluded to earlier on. Those who were classed as first offenders, second offenders, repeat offenders, hardened sinners. These are the fallen women of 1930s Ireland, those who find themselves pregnant outside of marriage. One searches in vain for the fallen men of that era of Irish history, but there are no shortage of fallen women. And of course, the consequences for them and their children in the mother and baby homes. The Bessborough Mother and Baby Home in Cork, for example. 47% of the children in Bessborough in 1939 died. It's as stark and as simple as that. You also, during that period, as you move into the early 1940s, get further iterations of this idea of an Ireland at peace with itself in relation to its ideals, its family ideals, its cherishing of children. Think of one of the most famous speeches that Eamon de Valera made in the course of his career, for example, in 1943. The Ireland that we dreamed of speech. The idea of the romping of sturdy children, the contests of athletic youths, the laughter of comely maidens. This was a look back, the 50th anniversary of the Gaelic League, of the Celtic Revival. The Ireland that we dreamed of, very much framed in the past tense. But what stands out for me in that particular speech is that phrase, the romping of sturdy children, because so few of the children that you find in so much of this documentation are romping sturdily, are romping at all. What you often get in ironic counterpoints to that speech in rural Ireland at that time is an emphasis on the generational continuity on the farm. The idea that children are needed to supply labour, that they need to be there as a hedge against old age. And emigration is also relevant here, as is the hiring fare of Patrick McGill's Children of the Dead End as far back as 1914 when he wrote about that. I was of no more value than something that was purchased in the marketplace, he said. Joe Lee has also suggested that few people anywhere were as prepared to scatter their children around the world in order to preserve their own living standards than were the Irish. So we do have some of those very harsh assessments that stand in contrast to that rhetoric of the 1930s and the 1940s. Nonetheless, there does seem to be progress being made at the level of policy. The introduction of children's allowances, for example, in 1944. But we know from behind the scenes that there was an intense debate and row within Fianna Fáil in 1944 about the appropriateness of that. Was that really about welfare, or was it about addressing the falling birth rate? Why was there such disagreement? Why were they so adamant that the children's allowance would be paid to the father as opposed to the mother, something that was to remain the case for many decades to come? We also had a revised curriculum, a revised programme for infants in 1948. And again, what you see here is an emphasis on the idea of childhood as a joyous time, a need for children to be engaged with active learning. But the extent to which that was implemented is again very much open to question. And in the very same year as that revised programme for infants, there were letters being written by Anne Lister. This was as a result of reports she was making as an inspector with the Department of Local Government and Public Health about various institutions that children were being held in. Her reports were being deliberately censored because she was raising the difficult questions. Why are the children in institutions not being valued? These are citizens, she said. They are our citizens. There should be no such thing, she said, as an unwanted child, as an unwanted baby. Censored as a result of her assertion of that basic truth. There was also then the question of adoption. Limited, very limited legal adoption finally appears in 1952, and very much framed by sectarian priorities. You also have it as a response to what was, in effect, an illegal export trade in relation to babies. Babies being taken from their mothers at a very early stage, being signed over, being given a false identity. Think about what that involves for the child and the mother. The dislocation that's involved, the search for an identity that goes on for decades. These files in relation to these illegal adoptions were not discovered until 1996. And it became very, very difficult to try and deal with the question of privacy and right of access. Whose rights can be vindicated and how can they be vindicated in the 1990s in relation to what was going on in the 1950s? In the words of one civil servant in the early 1950s, Ireland was a happy hunting ground for wealthy Americans who wanted to adopt white English-speaking children, and they were able to do it with considerable ease. Now, there are positives, and there is progress. In 1958, that same decade, for example, you have the National TB Centre reporting that there have been no new cases of TB discovered that year, 1958. The first time that that finding was made. And that, of course, was something that had killed so many thousands of children over the previous 150 years. But you also had continuities. Take the situation in relation to traveller children, for example. The Commission on Itinerancy, which reported in 1963. The focus very much on the idea that they needed to be assimilated, that the travelling people cannot be recognised as a minority ethnic community. They need to be assimilated. They don't have a distinct identity that can be recognised by the state. And then you have the infant mortality rates being highlighted during that period for the traveller communities. Twice the level of infant mortality as is being experienced by the settled population. Cut off from access to secondary school in particular. And yet this is also the great decade of the introduction of free secondary education. The momentous announcement that was made in 1966, the 50th anniversary of the 1916 Rising by the Minister for Education at the time, Donogh O'Malley. It was due to be introduced with effect from September 1967. Now, this was a solo run by Donogh O'Malley. This was not an introduction that was authorised at cabinet level, and there was vociferous opposition to this within the government on the grounds of cost and appropriateness. But it's interesting to look at what Donogh O'Malley said in 1966. Every year, he said, some 18,500 of our children are leaving school before or at the age of 14. cut off from all of the benefits that come with further education. The social benefits, the cultural benefits, the economic benefits. This, he said, is a dark stain on the national conscience. And it's a phrase that resonated and continues to resonate. He died very suddenly 2 years later, Donogh O'Malley, a young, ambitious, dashing politician. The Taoiseach at the time, Jack Lynch, paid tribute to him. When he spoke at his funeral, he said that Donogh O'Malley dared to dream beyond horizons, the limited horizons that the rest of us have. Not only dared to dream beyond them, he was reaching out, anxious to bestow good on his fellow citizens. And it left a question for me. Why were so few others prepared to dream beyond those horizons? Particularly when you look at the opposition that existed in the 1960s to that particular development. And it was a momentous development. But you still have the class element being very relevant to secondary education in subsequent decades. In 1981, for example, 16% of boys and 41% of girls from working class backgrounds, that was all that got to Leaving Cert levels. 16% of boys, 41% of girls, as opposed to 59% and 71% of middle-class boys and girls, respectively. Streaming was still very much a factor in the Irish education system and all that went with it. But there was a renewed focus on violence against children. A remarkably courageous individual who died very recently, Cyril Daly, spearheaded his campaign against corporal punishment in the schools the very same year that free secondary education was introduced. His campaign began at home because his children returned from the school they were attending and told him about the extent of the beating that was going on. He went in to see the school principal. He expressed his grave reservations about what was happening in the schools. And he was told if he didn't like it, he could take his students out of school, which is precisely what he did, and felt he had no other option during that period. But he went further than that. He wrote open letters, including one to the formidable Archbishop of Dublin, the Catholic Archbishop of Dublin, John Charles McQuaid, in 1968, saying that what was going on in the schools in relation to the use of violence was offensive to Christ's teaching. And he talked about the psychosexual deviation that he felt was associated with so many of these beatings. He was breaking taboos, a very difficult thing to do in the 1960s and the early 1970s. And others were coming under pressure to start looking at the institutional model and the appropriateness of it as you moved into the 1970s. Minister for Education, before he died, Donogh O'Malley, had been adamant that the skin needed to be pulled off the pudding of the industrial school system in Ireland, what ultimately led to the Kennedy Committee that reported in 1970. But not all of the evidence, of course, that the Kennedy Committee received was published, including evidence of naked beatings at the Dangan Reformatory School in Offaly. There was that reluctance, of course, to challenge still the model of institutionalization. And that had deep roots, that reluctance. If you go back to 1954, you can find an extraordinary speech by the Minister for Education, Sean Moylan, in the Dáil in 1954. Minister for Education, of course, being responsible for these particular institutions which are state-funded. Sean Moylan was reacting in 1954 to a mother who had found out what was going on in Artane, whose son had been beaten to within an inch of his life by a very young Christian brother. And she contacted her local TD, Peadar Cowan, who brought this issue up in the Dáil. And Sean Moylan, in response, said this: "I cannot conceive of any sadism emanating from men who are trained to have devotion to a higher purpose. I cannot conceive. Accidents," he said, "happen in the best regulated families. And the family in Artane is a very large and a very difficult family." But that kind of response perhaps could not be sustained as you move into subsequent decades. What we get in the early 1970s in particular is the idea of a renewed look at child-centred education, at a child-centred approach to child care that I don't need to labour given your expertise. The idea, even at the educational level, with a revised primary curriculum in 1971, that it will be much more child-focused. You have the school-leaving age raised to 15 in 1972, something that had first been proposed in 1935 but had been continually postponed. You also have the introduction of unmarried mothers' allowance in 1973, which one sociologist has described as, in ideological terms, like stepping onto a new planet. Official recognition for the unmarried mother and, of course, the unmarried mother's child. But you also had opposition to the idea of less religion in education. The Dalkey School Project, for example, of 1978. Another very important milestone, very small but important. The idea that the state would actually finance a non-denominational school for the first time since the foundation of the state. But we know from the archives that Cardinal Conway, behind the scenes, was making sure that the Taoiseach at the time, Jack Lynch, knew that the Catholic Church, in Conway's words, wanted to keep control of schools and wanted the government to take its hands off our schools. And that use of "our" was particularly significant. An extremist Catholic organisation released a pamphlet in response to the Dalkey School project in 1978. And it asked this question: are the snakes coming back to Ireland? Now, there was a vast improvement in the health of children, and that's apparent in the early 1980s. 2.78% of all those who died in Ireland in 1981 were under the age of 5. As opposed to the figure I cited earlier of 20% in 1911. Corporal punishment was finally abolished in the schools in 1982. The Status of Children Act in 1987 in effect abolished the legal concept of illegitimacy. You also had, during the 1980s, cultural wars that were going on in relation to divorce and abortion. Now, there were a lot of assertions made about the rights of children, about what was best for children during that period. But what did that actually mean in practice? Well, that's another question entirely. Again, the extent to which children can be used during these campaigns, or the idea of children's rights can be used during these campaigns, often by those who are not particularly focused at all on the rights or the welfare of children or their cherishing. So we do need to be aware of that. And in parallel, of course, we do have the development of a nostalgia for historic Irish childhood. One of the best-selling books in 1988, for example, was Alice Taylor's To School Through the Fields, the idyllic rural childhood. But the very same year, we also had, again, a counterpoint to that. Paddy Doyle's The God Squad, also published in 1988, a searing account of what he had suffered, his experiences in an industrial school, and what certain nuns had subjected him and other children to. So we do have these, again, parallel and very contrasting narratives going on by the end of the 1980s. We also, of course, as you move into the early 1990s, and you'll be very aware of all of these landmarks, we have further commitments to the improvement of child welfare. The Child Welfare Act, for example, of 1991. And in the middle of that, we also have the 1992 X case. Very memorable, very controversial, very harrowing. The image that was seared on the minds of many was actually a cartoon image drawn by Martin Turner, put on the front page of the Irish Times in 1992. The introduction of internment in Ireland for 14-year-old girls. His response to the decision that that young girl, pregnant as a result of rape and suicide, was not allowed travel outside of Ireland for an abortion, and all the controversy that stemmed from that, and all the unfinished business that was so apparent during that period and remained so up to relatively recently, if it was ever in any way solved at all. The following year, of course, we had the Kilkenny incest case. And again, what Catherine McGuinness did as a consequence of the Kilkenny incest case was to highlight the emphasis in the Constitution on the rights of family. To highlight within the Constitution the idea that the rights of family or the rights of parents were given a much higher value, that there was a need for a specific and overt declaration of the rights of the born child. And that is very deliberate, the born child. There was so much heard in the previous 10 years about the unborn child. And Catherine McGuinness was trying to focus attention on the born child, the rights of the born child. We also, of course, get during that period the beginning of a new phase of memoir, the idea of the miserable Irish childhood, made famous by Frank McCourt's Angela's Ashes, published in 1996. The happy childhood is hardly worth your while, was the assertion of Frank McCourt, and of course publishers tended to agree. By 2000, the leading bookshop in Dublin city centre had a specific shelf that was devoted to what it called painful lives. And that was the label, painful lives. And this, in a sense, had become something of an industry. But again, it did prompt something of a debate about the experiences of children, about what they had felt. To go back to this point about a parallel stream of information, it doesn't mean they're all entirely reliable, but none of our sources are entirely reliable. What it did lead to was more debate. And what we did get then was the idea at the turn of the 21st century of a national children's strategy, that children's lives would be better understood. But you still had within the education system these difficulties. This idea of an Equal Status Act, the idea that there was still an obligation on the state to buttress the promotion of religion, to finance the promotion of religion, and that could result in the exclusion of children who were not reared as Catholics. This remains outrageous. It remains surprising to me that it has not been constitutionally challenged, and obviously it's something that's of particular relevance to those who are seeking to forge different educational models, very contemporary projects and very controversial projects. Now again, you did have also in 2004 a citizenship referendum. The idea that too many parents who had insufficient connections with Ireland, as was used at the time, that this needed to be addressed. The idea that children born here of foreign national parents should not be allowed automatic citizenship or entitled to automatic citizenship. That raised some ugly questions and some ugly debates also. The idea that far too many families as a result of that were going to remain in limbo and have remained in limbo. And then in 2009, we had the publication of the Ryan Report, a monument to the hidden histories that I have spoken about earlier. The human testimony and the power of what those victims were able to tell. 216 institutions covered in the Ryan Report of 2009. What were the consequences of this architecture of containment that I referred to earlier on? The enormity of what was revealed and how it might be absorbed and how it might instruct. Now, I would finish by saying there have been very positive developments since the children's rights referendum, which was alluded to earlier on in 2012. What struck me as a historian about that particular debate was the extent to which many of the arguments of the 1950s were being rehashed, the arguments that were used by Catholic social theorists, the idea that this would work against the interests of parents, that it wasn't in the best interests of the child, that it would lead to the expanded state, the totalitarian state, arguments that were often used in the 1940s and the 1950s, that it would reduce the parental role, that it would violate the sacrosanct family unit. It was rightly presented, I think, as a milestone. But we are also very well aware, all of you are, that it's one thing to have those rights enshrined in the Constitution. It's another thing entirely to give them meaning by giving sufficient resources. You can't just have this rhetorical or constitutional commitment if it isn't resourced effectively to actually mean a lot in practice. So we do have those profound cultural changes and we need to acknowledge them. But we also have depressing continuities. Donald referred there earlier on to the frightening statistics about child poverty. Child poverty has doubled in this state since 2008. And it brings me back to where I started in relation to the 1916 proclamation. The idea of real as opposed to notional citizenship. There has been a challenge to what Kathleen Lynch, the Cork politician, once referred to as the politics of mutism in relation to children. The politics of mutism that traditionally silenced children's voices. But that's only partially been challenged. The system of direct provision that we have in this country is hideous and is something to be thoroughly ashamed of in the early 21st century. As I speak, victims of the Carrick Mines Inferno last week are being buried in Wexford. What does that say about the extent to which traveller communities and traveller children are cherished equally? So we do have to continue to think about those issues and to challenge difficult scenarios and to prompt those difficult debates. We have to come back to this question, I suppose, of what are the lights of our time in relation to the 1916 proclamation. Next March, the primary school children of Ireland will be asked to author their own proclamations as they see fit, a proclamation for a new generation. Now, you could express scepticism or cynicism about this development by responding, why can't we just implement the proclamation that we already have? But again, I'd go back to the point that I started with. If that kind of initiative, if the kind of initiative that you're going to unveil today does lead again to a new focus on child welfare, does prompt debate again on welfare and a renewed vigour around the issue of child welfare, well then the centenary of the 1916 Rising, I think, will have created something that's very positive, something that's very constructive, and something that's essential. I wish you the best for your conference, and thank you for your time.